Hello everybody, this is Nickie Aiken, the MP for the Cities of London and Westminster. You join me today for a podcast that I'm doing with the theatre and cultural venues from across my constituency, as well as the Heart of London Business District and also UKHospitality trade organisation. We've come together today to talk about how theatres and cultural venues have been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, and more importantly, how it moves on as lockdown is lifted. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Julian Bird from the Society of London Theatres, Alex Beard, the Royal Opera House, Craig Hassel from the Royal Albert Hall, Ross Morgan from the Heart of London Business Improvement District, and Kate Nichols from UKHospitality. Thank you all for your time today and for joining me. I've got a couple of questions to start the podcast. And perhaps, Julian, you could start. What are the particular challenges that West End theatres in particular, but theatres in general, have been dealing with and are facing during the current crisis?
Great, thanks, Nickie, and thank you for arranging this. So obviously, the Society of London Theatre looks after theatre in the core part of London, essentially the West End and the bits surrounding it. 50 plus of the major theatres that are known worldwide, not just within the UK. Over 15 million, nearly 15.5 million attendees every year at those theatres, which obviously, as I often say, is more than go to all Premier League football games. So this is a huge volume of people. And of course, each show attracts a different kind of demographic, but very roughly between that, roughly a third of those are international visitors, roughly a third are Londoners, and roughly a third are home counties or rest of the UK tourism. So we are faced with a situation, obviously, where all theatres and all venues are currently dark. They are closed. They've been closed for north of 9 weeks now, with no huge prospect of reopening. So there is no ticket income, there is no secondary spend, there's no spend on catering or anything else. And not only is that impacting on the theatres themselves and their own operations, it's also hugely having an impact on the West End and the local economy. The estimates are there's a multiplier of something like 5 to 6 times. In other words, what somebody spends on a ticket, they spend 5 to 6 times in the local economy, hotels, bars, restaurants, etc. And obviously, very specifically for our sector is social distancing and the issues around mass gathering and social distancing at 2 metres or even the WHO guideline of 1.5 metres. Would leave pretty much every auditorium, every theatre, unable to open economically. It would take our capacity down to between sort of 15 and 25%, depending on which you use, 1.5 or 2 metres. That's clearly not an economic model that anybody can actually survive on. And if the theatres don't open, there will be a huge knock-on to the West End as a whole. So to answer your question, there is absolutely a risk to venues. There's a risk to productions never reopening. Some of the things that London is so famous for never happening. There is a risk to venues. Our recent survey told us that around 70% of people potentially run out of cash by the end of this year. And that's a terribly, obviously worrying statistic as to where we are. So, I'm sure we'll come on to solutions, but just looking at the facts as of today, we're in a pretty difficult situation.
Okay, thank you so much. It'd be good to bring Craig and Alex in as the chief execs of world-renowned venues, the Royal Albert Hall and the Royal Opera House. Gentlemen, how are you personally finding it with your venues at the moment?
Well, let me jump in. It's Craig here. Thanks, Nickie, and thanks for organising today. It's really helpful to get the word out. I'm sure Alex will agree. We're in a perilous situation. We're an independent venue. We're unusual in that we're a charity without government funding. So we rely 100% on people coming through the doors and buying tickets. And most of our events are somebody else hiring our hall. So as Julian said, with the current measures in place, we could open to about 35%, which would make it immediately not viable for every promoter that hires the hall, which includes Cirque du Soleil, proms, film premieres, the Olivier Awards. I mean, everything wouldn't be possible. So with that scenario, we could present some shows ourselves and we could survive till about April of next year, then we'd be insolvent. And the thought of the Royal Albert Hall closing is inconceivable. I can't believe it, but it's a reality that we're looking at now based on this situation. So yeah, it's pretty grim. How's yours,
Thanks.
Alex?
Well, more of the same, I'm afraid. And again, Nickie, thanks so much for this. Hugely appreciated and very timely indeed. So in our case, we've got very modest reserves. They'll see us through into the autumn, maybe late autumn, but certainly not into the new year. And although we do receive an Arts Council grant, in our case, that's less than £1 in every 5 of our budget. And sort of at the heart of our business is our enterprise is absolutely the antithesis of social distancing. We're bringing north of 100 people on stage with 100 people in the pit, performing to 2,000 people in the auditorium, hopefully giving them the time of their lives, and we need 95% occupancy to break even. So whether it's 25% or 35%, or even if we could shave it up to 40% with large family groups, that's clearly not it's clearly not a viable situation. And the other thing that I guess is slightly different for us is that we have a huge staff, and not only staff but artists. So we're the single largest employer of artists in the country after the BBC, and the accumulated skills and talents of those artists is the equivalent for us of the national collections for the museums. You think about the Royal Ballet, it was founded after the Second World War. It's taken 70 years for it to be shoulder to shoulder with the Mariinsky and the Bolshois, the leading ballet company in the world. And those artists have to be kept together through this, but also they have to have the opportunity to express themselves. So we're determined to do whatever we can as soon as we can, but what it isn't going to be is economically viable, and we're not going to be able to sustain it beyond the relatively short term without a spectacular joint effort of our determination and skill, the support of our audience and philanthropists, but also government.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Craig. If I can bring in Kate and Ros now to give an even bigger picture, I'm very conscious that the West End is basically based on an ecology. It's the venues, the theatres, the likes of the Royal Opera House, the Royal Albert Hall and others that are they bring in the visitors. They are usually the reason why perhaps international visitors are coming in from Europe and wider afield, and also obviously across the UK. And the people who are coming in for the weekend perhaps to go and see a production are also then staying in a hotel. They're going to enjoy a meal, at least one meal out, if not more. They're going to go to the bars. They're also going to enjoy a retail experience. So Kate, from your experience now as UK Hospitality, what are your concerns about the challenges that our entertainment and cultural venues are facing at the moment?
I think you're absolutely right, Nickie, to say that it's a fragile ecosystem, and it needs to be looked at as a whole ecosystem. You can't stand up bits of it in part and hamstring others, because clearly in the centre of London, if you look, we represent pubs, bars, restaurants, nightclubs. There is going to be no point in allowing some of those places to reopen if you haven't got the people coming back into the offices, if you haven't got the visitor attractions, if you haven't got the theatre, the Royal Albert Hall. It all comes together to be mutually supportive and make it viable. So for our hotels, pubs, bars, restaurants, there's a viability test which Gillian's outlined to do with the physical distancing, the social distancing. But there's also the secondary test that you just won't have those customers coming, even if you could break even by having 2 metre social distancing. You face the double whammy that people are not coming back to their offices, people are not coming back as day trippers and tourists. That's just from sort of home counties. So it is like the financial crash, 9/11, the terrorist attacks, all at once, coupled with a very tight set of restrictions that the government is forcing us to operate with. And for our businesses, they started to feel the effects of this back in January when international visitor numbers plummeted. And when we saw sort of visitor numbers in the centre of London contract as a result of that, but also contract because international businesses started sending out messages to their workforce: stay at home, work at home, no meetings of more than 6 people. So we had a knock-on effect then. So these businesses have been at very low revenue levels all the way from beginning of February to potentially 4th of July. So I think that they would love to be sitting on reserves of the type that we've just talked about. I don't want to minimise or downplay the seriousness of the situation that the Royal Albert Hall and the Royal Opera House find themselves in. But for many of our restaurants, pubs, bars, and to a lesser extent our hotels, they are talking about weeks where they will run out of cash and be starting to make redundancy decisions next month. And then you won't have the support system and the ecosystem that the Royal Albert Hall and Royal Opera House and the London theatres will need when they're finally given the green light to go ahead. You'll find that the theatres and the cultural sites can reopen and there's no hospitality in support of them.
Okay, thank you for that. Roz, obviously you are the Chief Exec of the Business Improvement District that takes in the theatre land, it takes in Leicester Square and the very famous cinemas in that square, and obviously also the restaurants, bars, hotels. From your perspective, what are you seeing at the moment and what are your concerns for the future?
Yes, Nickie, thank you. We represent about 600 businesses across that area that you describe. And it's a relatively small patch, but it is critical to the economy. It generates a GVA of about 5 billion and has a workforce of about 46,000 and tens of thousands when you talk about the supply chain across the UK. But within that little patch, you've got something like 40 global attractions and institutions. Many of you on the call today, but we've got the National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery, BAFTA, 40, 50 premieres a year, English National Opera and the theatres themselves. So, you know, the entire environment is built around that kind of cultural and art attraction and draw. And, you know, going into the area now is very, very sad. It lacks that buzz, the atmosphere, the experience that you experience whenever you're coming in to see these things. And absolutely, you know, businesses, some of our businesses will be able to open from the 15th of June. But the genuine question that they're asking is it worth their while opening so soon? Because they are entirely reliant on this leisure, art, cultural offer to support their business, and without it, actually, it probably isn't viable for them to open. You know, we bring in about 200 million people into the area each and every year, and I have to say that the majority of those do come in for the cultural institutions. It's what we are globally renowned for, and you know, it's how we stand out from the crowd. So I think the real question is how do we balance? I mean, from our perspective, we need the cultural and arts back as soon as possible. If we want the West End back performing to some degree this year, we absolutely need to find a model that allows the cultural and art institutions and attractions to be able to balance out the kind of financial viability with the social distancing measures. And I think some will be able to do that sooner, faster than others. You know, I'm thinking about, I know the challenges that the theatres themselves have. I think, Julian, that, you know, the idea of social distancing in the theatre kind of sucks out the essence of, you know, the whole theatre experience. But I can imagine it working a bit easier, a bit better, a bit more streamlined in, say, a museum or a gallery, even a cinema to some extent, because you can book in advance to get into some of these cinemas. But in the West End, let's not forget that actually the big draw to the West End cinemas is actually the premieres that go with it. So the challenge for the cinemas is they could literally open tomorrow if they were given the go ahead. But which film studios are going to offer up their films if they're not going to draw in the crowds for these huge, you know, premieres that they really...
Well, we saw the James Bond, didn't we? We saw the James Bond premiere cancelled until later on in the year, and it'd be interesting if that does launch in November as now expected. Okay, so moving forward now, what do your industries actually require from government and other authorities, perhaps local councils, to open? I've been talking to ministers about relaxing the 2 metre rule to perhaps 1 or 1.5 meters, because that is what's happening in other countries. That's what the WHO, I think, says 1 meter is acceptable. But what are the practicalities that you are looking for and from government to be able to even consider reopening? Julian?
Well, I think let's start with social distancing. You know, for people with venues, with seated auditoriums, or indeed for bars and restaurants, it all comes down to how many people can you put in that space. Can you get near a capacity that enables you to just break even? Let's not even talk around making a profit. And you know, all the work, you know, thank you, Craig and Alex and many other people whose organisations are contributing. You know, the government have now launched the working group, the work to work with Public Health England and the medics to get us towards the situation that sport are getting to in terms of, you know, thinking about reopening. But there's no doubt that in all those conversations, social distancing is still the mantra. And there is at the moment no inclination of moving to anything like 1 meter in any conversation that anyone has been party to. Yes, maybe they might consider moving to 1.5 meters, perhaps, but that for theatres will make or the Albert Hall would make almost no difference. It certainly wouldn't get us near the capacities we would need to break even. So I think, you know, we have to look at models from overseas, the much discussed South Korea model where Phantom of the Opera is sort of open. We have to look at what's going on in Australia at the moment, where there's some innovative thinking. We have to look to some of the states in America, which are at the verge of reopening. Places like Las Vegas, who specialize their whole city built on bringing mass groups of people into a building, where there's huge amounts of thought going on. So we have to look to all of those and go, is there stuff there that could be applied in this country that would satisfy the medics, the scientists, but more crucially also satisfy audiences that they would feel safe and secure? That's not going to be quick. That's not going to be easy. We are going to need, as Alex rightly said, significant financial support as we get to that. And I think all of us have touched on the fact that there's going to be a lack of tourism into the West End for some considerable period of time. Even if we could all open tomorrow, international tourism is estimated to be close to zero for the rest of the year. And so that's a huge impact for all of us as well. So, you know, the challenges are many and great. You know, we've just launched our huge ask of the government just today of what we would like to see them do for the entire sector. But
what does that include?
Well, that includes everything from, you know, sustaining our workforce, job retention scheme. You know, the entertainment sector, our sector, has about 70% freelancers and self-employed. You know, they're not being well looked after at the moment. And as Alex said, you know, if we lose the ecosystem that we've built up over generations, if that goes away and we lose the incredible skills in our industry, we're not going to be able to come back quickly from it. Okay. So there's stuff around the workforce, there's stuff around recovery, changes that could be made to tax rules, tax laws. You know, we need to make sure that the whole ecosystem, all those many, many small companies, a lot of whom are based in the West End, that they all survive this, as well as the actual venues and everything. And then, of course, you know, we have some innovative ideas with the government around injecting real funds into every organisation in the country. And it looks, as we go on, more and more like we are going to need that, you know, and we wait and now talk to the government around all of that. But crucially, to reopen, it all ends up coming back to social distancing. And could we move forward with a model that doesn't include social distancing, but does include a whole safety protocol that our staff will feel comfortable with and the public feel comfortable with in terms of coming into public buildings? Craig,
how would you do that from the Royal Albert Hall's perspective? How could you even think about opening in, wouldn't be next week, it would be perhaps in the autumn, but what would you want to see before you could open?
Sure. Well, Julian summarised it very well. The key to this is a change in the protocols for audiences, staff and artists and crew. We talk about relaxing the guidelines. I think that's not really correct. We don't want to relax the guidelines. Safety has to be paramount. Safety of the artists, safety of the crew, safety of our staff and safety of the audiences. But there are other ways to keep our constituents safe which is not about a distance apart. It's about checks and balances on the way into the auditorium. So for the Royal Albert Hall, we would have a new cleaning regime, a different way to approach going to the toilet, I mean, all sorts of things, and different checks on the way in. So heat testing on the way in, sanitizing as you come in. There's a whole lot of things. Julian mentioned the South Korea example, and it's a really potent one. It's a production of the Phantom of the Opera, which is playing to 2,000 people potential capacity in a 2,000-seat theatre. And they've managed to achieve that by having a whole range of measures as people come to the theatre. So when you have that level of scrutiny and observation and checking, it means when you're inside the venue, you can have people a lot more closely together than you might have in a park or an outdoor venue. So the social distancing amendment or increased scrutiny and protocol with the support of the sector, and the government has to listen to what the sector is saying. That's probably the most fundamental point of all, I'd say, Nickie.
And Alex, obviously you are thinking of the short, medium and long term for the Royal Opera House, but practically, where are you at now for even thinking about when you could actually physically open, and how do you work back on that? I mean, obviously you've got the big Christmas market coming along, and I guess that you people spoil themselves with the run up to Christmas and will have a special trip to the opera or the ballet. So what are you doing now? Are you even considering opening in the autumn?
So look, we're looking at a number of different scenarios. I think in the absence of protocols that deal with social distancing, and I completely agree with Craig that also maintain as a top priority the safety of performers, audiences, and backstage staff. In the absence of that, there's no way that we can come back to present, the Nutcracker or La Traviata as in its full guise. It's just not doable. So, but I am hopeful that, with the experience that's being seen in Australia, in Europe, in South Korea, that we will be able to refine and develop a set of protocols that will work. I just think it's going to take some time. So the scenarios we're looking at is, we're keeping the autumn open. I think it's very, very unlikely. Christmas also, to be honest, I think that's unlikely. More likely into 2021. In the meantime, I think it's really important that we show that we're still there. And so we're looking at ways of, and this isn't going to make money at all. That's probably going to cost money. But we're looking at ways in which we can do performances initially in a closed house that we can stream, but also thinking about how we can reconceive orchestrations so that they're manageable in a socially distanced way, scale up chamber work, just to show that the great theatres on which the reputation of UKPLC London is founded are still here and still open for business, to keep that flame alive, because as we all know that it takes a heck of a lot more energy to start a fire than to keep one going, and particularly given the accumulated skills that are there in the staff, and that we have just somehow got to find a way of keeping going and being there for our audiences, even if it doesn't make money. So we're looking at various ways in which we can do that, and I hope that we might be able to do at least one or two things surprisingly soon. But it's not about, I'm afraid, a viable economic model. It's just a way of showing that we're here for audiences and doing what we can when we can. I think it's going to be a number of months before we can be back up and running, and anything like full pelt, for all the reasons that Craig and Julian have said. But having said that, like all of us, I'm a hardwired optimist. No one would be in the performing arts unless you were. I mean, it's just not. And also, as I say, I'm fortunate enough to spend working life with lots of artists, and artists are defined by their creativity, imagination, and determination. And I think with all of that, the collective will, support from government, I think I'm optimistic that we will find a way there, but it's going to be one heck of a journey, and it will need all of those three. It will need the three legs of our efforts, the support of our audiences and government to get us there.
Can I ask Craig and Alex? We've seen, obviously, and I know the Royal Opera House has been putting productions online and streaming them, and we've seen that from the National Theatre and others. Can you see a time for the next 6 to 12 months where you could have a new business model where your productions, you put new productions on, but they were streamed and you actually charged people, I'm not saying full whack, but something that where you would perhaps break even if not make a profit? I mean, is that something reasonably that we could look at in the new post-COVID world in the medium term?
I'll come in first on that, which is the short answer is no. But there's a much longer answer, which is that the way the streaming works is that basically all of the costs of pre-production, rehearsal period, getting it up and running, that's all paid for by the ticket sales, and the capture of the performance itself and then subsequent streaming of it, whether it's into broadcast into cinemas or television or online, is the tip of that enormous, great big economic iceberg. And the economics of streaming pay-per-view, even with the best will in the world, just won't even cover a fraction of that. Now, that's not to say that we won't do anything. We will do some things, but they're going to be much smaller scale, experimental, a bit more provisional. But by necessity a lot cheaper, just to show that we're still there. But I'm afraid the core business model just does not work on streaming or pay-per-view alone. That's the tip of this enormous, great big performing iceberg.
Yeah, just to support that, Nickie, the answer is no as well for us. There are a few things we've done since we closed. We've had great success with Royal Albert Home, where we've had Rufus Wainwright and Alfie Boe performing from their bedrooms, and Katie Tunstall from her studio in LA. It's been great. And we've had 500,000 views, and it's been wonderful. It's all free, free to the public. It costs us money. We've earned about £90,000 in donations. We would normally have earned about £8.5 million in ticket sales over the same period. So just to give you an idea of the difference. And the challenge for a place like the Royal Albert Hall is we have a 5,500 seat venue, which we normally fill 400 times a year. So it's great. Digital's great, but it's only an adjunct. And the best digital, as Alex says, it's content that had already appeared live. So it was, in our case, Adele at the Royal Albert Hall is the highest selling DVD of a concert anywhere ever in the history of DVDs. But it's because it's Adele performing at the Royal Albert Hall to an absolutely packed auditorium. Once you take away the audience, digital becomes a little bit dull, I have to say. And this is probably a terrible thing to say while Julian's on the call, but I've tried to watch National Theatre live and so on, and I love the National Theatre and I love the young Vic. I find theatre on YouTube misses a dimension. I'd rather be at the Royal Opera House watching La Traviata than watching it in a cinema even. And I know that that's an important part of business models, but the live event is what we're all about. And if you take away the live event, what have we got left? I think it's you can't have one without the other, and digital can never replace the live event.
And just to amplify that for 1 second, the being in one space together, reflecting on the things that unite us, the absolutely fundamental aspects of the human condition: love, despair, loss, hope. That's a fundamental human urge, and we've been doing that, ever since we've been singing around a campfire after a Paleolithic kill, and that fundamental urge is what theatre is all about. The urge to congregate, to come together, to reflect on our shared experience, to celebrate our humanity. It sounds highfalutin stuff, but it is the essence of it. And as wonderful as this Zoom call is, it lacks that immediacy.
Nickie, sorry, yeah. You know, just listening to everybody now, I suppose, you know, everybody's trying to think outside the box, think of various models, etc. I completely appreciate the principal idea of trying to do something and keep something ticking over, and that would be hugely valued by the F&B and hotels whenever they can open. But I just feel that there's an even greater need, a whole shift potentially in government's approach and thinking towards this industry, because, you know, really it is absolutely critical for this industry to come back as soon as possible in all its glory. It's critical for not just the economic recovery of the country, but the social recovery of the country as well. And so, you know, I would argue, you know, as we probably are doing here, it needs serious intervention, financial intervention. And I would call it an investment rather than a bailout or a grant or a support or whatever, because actually, you know, this sector has the potential to be maybe the slowest to return, but the quickest to kind of recover. And the return on that investment is absolutely phenomenal. And, you know, I think someone said it earlier that it would be much cheaper to invest now and allow these businesses to operate and to provide that kind of social opportunity and support this wider F&B hotel sector as well, than it would be to let it completely collapse, use all of the trade, and then having to invest. I mean, it'll cost a fortune to try to build
something like some sort of grant system, where a loan system which could then be based on Craig, and I think Kate, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think Roz is absolutely right. I think the quicker we can get our sectors open safely and swiftly, the better it will be for the health and well-being of this country. And I think we underestimate, and nobody's really done that sort of cost-benefit analysis of what is it doing to our mental health and well-being, that we don't have access to some of the best things in life that sort of make life worth living, you know, sort of meeting up with friends, having social space, going out and seeing the best of culture. And I think that there is a very narrow way of looking at industries in this country that sort of values, almost to the point of fetishizing, manufacturing and ignoring culture, arts, leisure and recreation, which actually the experience economy is what is driving our economic growth. You know, our sector in hospitality grew by almost 5% last year. It's an export earner that's worth over £40 billion. It generates £40 billion in tax for the exchequer each year. These are things that are hugely important. And in a way, it's almost invisible as far as a lot of the politicians are concerned, the certain notable exceptions aside. But, you know, if this was a car plant, if this was a sort of big manufacturing steel plant, people would be falling over themselves and talking about the exports. The amount of exports that are generated in the City of London and Westminster are phenomenal. And as I say, I think it's worth saving for that reason, and it's worth getting it back on track for that reason. And I do think we've got to move on, as Craig says, from this very fixed, rigid idea of what is the way that we can reopen safely, whether that's to do with quarantine or whether it's to do with social distancing. These are measures which are being put in place which are going to significantly impair our successful restart and our ability to recover culturally. And they need to be assessed in that round assessment, not just from a public health prism or not just from an economic prism, but we need to have the evidence. It needs to be published. We need to make clear that these are tests which should be removed over time. And when it comes to social distancing, it isn't a new normal that we can learn to live with. We have to use it to get through very swiftly a transitional period, to get in place additional controls or alternative infection measures, and learn from our Southeast Asian counterparts as to how to do this and get normal life back. It cannot be a new normal that we can't go out and have a drink or a meal or go to the Royal Opera House or go to a theatre, because at the end of it, Ros is right, we will come back and there will be nothing there. And our economy and our culture and our tourism will be that much poorer as a result of it. And we have to get back to having international tourists visiting us. Otherwise, to our reputation will be far longer than the short-term benefit we get from having a quarantine in place.
Thanks. Craig, you're desperate to come in, I can see.
I am. Thanks, Nickie. Just a point on the money side, and it's a really good point that Ros makes. It's unusual to think about places like the Royal Albert Hall or the West End going to government for support. Now, the Royal Opera House is funded, but honestly, I've run both an opera company and a ballet company, and there is no way those companies can work without government subsidy. So that the subsidized sector and the commercial sector and places like us who are somewhere in between, we're at a moment where, in our case, we're going from a going concern that earns £8 million profit every year to essentially insolvent. We want to return to a position of independence where we are once again independent. So does the West End, so does the Royal Opera House. We all want to get back to where we were before. And for some of us, it means being subsidized to a moderate level. And for others of us, it means no subsidy once again. And we're thrilled about that. But at this moment in time, we have to keep the sector alive to allow it to survive and to grow again. As Kate said, it's so much part of the ecology. Places like, the Lyceum Theatre and the Royal Opera House, the Royal Albert Hall. It's so important for London and the UK to have this whole infrastructure supported. And the job retention scheme has been fundamentally important for all of us in keeping us alive during this period. And that, I would suggest, has to be maintained, certainly for the cultural sector, hospitality sector, those of us who are going to be the last cabs off the rank. And we understand that we are down the food chain in terms of reopening, but please keep us in business so we can reopen confidently and properly when the time is right.
So how do we do that? So Ros mentioned about some investment. So is there some sort of grant scheme that the government could consider? How would that work? What would they actually be investing in? How much would the industry need? Craig, you talk about that you need support to keep going, because eventually, once you are open and business as normal for both you and for Alex and the theatres, you will make profits. We have some major commercial operators in the West End: Andrew Lloyd Webber, Cameron McIntosh, Nicker Burns, and many others. So what would the scheme look like, and what would it do?
Well, in fact, Julian has just presented this. I think is best to answer this. So there's a range of things depending on the kind of makeup of organisation you are, and it varies so wildly. I mean, Julian, you know more about this than I do.
You're right. I mean, I think the starting point from this is we're trying to look at something that can work across the whole ecology of theatre and performing arts. So Craig talks around organisations like the Royal Albert Hall. We'd add, maybe not in your patch, Nickie, but we'd add places like Shakespeare's Globe, the Old Vic, and hundreds of organisations across the country, actually, who are in the same position as Craig is at the Albert Hall. They are independent charities and trusts with basically no current government subsidy. You've then got organisations like Alex at the Royal Opera House, and there are many like that, the National Theatre, the RSC, who have some form of investment from the government. And nowadays, remember, that's at a much smaller level than ever in history. Actually, our organisations, places like the Opera House, have become absolutely extraordinary at both raising money philanthropically, but also trading brilliantly, not just from ticket sales, but from bars, from catering, from broadcast and all those things. So the very things that people have done to become more financially robust in the past slightly now put them at more of a challenge, because the government subsidy makes up a much smaller proportion of their income. And then, of course, yes, you've got some commercial operators. And yes, there are one or two who, let's be honest, have made a lot of money in their business and, over their lives. But most commercial theatre operators and most producers are young. We've done a huge amount of work in bringing them forward. They don't have huge resources to fall back on. So, this is hitting all three parts, all those three pillars of our sector, if you like. So yes, we have two main concepts. One, as Alex said, is, there does need to be some money into the sector in terms of grants. But the other is, we've had some great people working on it's not a loan scheme. We've called it the Cultural Investment Participation Scheme, where we ask the government to effectively participate in these organisations going forward, both as venues or as productions, with absolutely a return back. Exactly what Craig said. It's a short-term, if you like, investment into our sector one by one, which you end up paying back and potentially paying back with profit in the long term, but then means that organisations are free after that to go back to being, in the long run, run independently and survive and absolutely thrive.
So it could be something like a bond. So you're basically asking the government to invest in supporting the arts bonds, and they get their money back. I mean, it sounds brilliant, really.
It's a long-term participation scheme. That's what it is. Whereas,
how long will it last for? How would you see it? A year, 2, 3, 5?
Would depend on each organisation and the arrangements, and it might be different for commercial to a charity. But crucially, the government have introduced lots of different loan schemes, as we know, for this coronavirus issue. For the vast majority of those, things like the business interruption loans don't work for our sector for a multitude of reasons. If you're a charity or a trust, you have huge restrictions over what you can do. Our commercial operators often operate production by production, so haven't got a back record to fall back on. It's just the way we structure our industry, which has enabled us to do the innovation that Alex and people have talked about. And now, we're saying to the government, come to the table. Let's take a long-term view at this, be part of our future.
It's a brilliant idea. I mean, it's about investing in the arts, isn't it? It's also investing in our cultural history, but also our cultural future, and also our mental well-being of the nation.
We've got the word investment in the title of what we're proposing for a reason. That's why the word
absolutely.
is very much about an investment in this sector going forward.
How much at the ballpoint, I wouldn't hold you to it, but for the whole of the nation, if you like, or particularly in England, how much would you be looking for the government to invest? How much will it take how much, Julian, will it take to save West End Theatre, the Royal Opera House?
Well, very roughly so we've looked at that on a 3-month basis, because of course what we don't know is how soon people can open. So if you just give a blank figure, it's like, well, that depends on what estimate you put. But we think for every 3 months, it's somewhere north of £300 million. But that's across the whole country, is the sort of lost income, the money that would ensure that organisations can be closed, keep hold of the skill base that they have. We believe within that money, people would be able to do some of the fantastic outreach work and the audience engagement that Alex and Craig have talked about. But just to put that into context, you've got, I'm not going to name names, but there are major, commercial companies in this country who are asking for bailouts of billions for just a single commercial company. We're talking around 330 million pounds to save a sector for every quarter that we're closed. I'm not saying it's a bargain. Of course it's not, and government has to make choices. But to save a sector in which we genuinely lead the world. We're not just saying things here. It is widely acknowledged that we lead the world in this area. To save that, I think it's a price worth paying for the government. And that's
so basically, what we're saying today is for £500 million, we could save pantomime.
Well, yes. I mean, potentially. Going back to how you do pantomime with an audience of only 100 people in a huge auditorium is interesting.
Well, exactly.
But there, of course, with a bedrock of funding, theatres could afford to do more things in a socially distanced way, because it makes up that shortfall between 20% audience and 70 or 80%, or in Alex's case, even more than that you need to break even. There is a gap there that you have to fill somewhere, and if you can't fill it, venues can't open. And the basis of that means people will be made redundant, we will lose the skill base, and it will put actually at long-term risk all these organisations and the whole ecosystem, going back to that.
Exactly. Can I bring Kate back in a sec? Because just talking about the pantomime, because obviously pantomime is the bedrock of many regional theatres. And I know we're looking at the West End in particular and Central London here, but on a serious note, there are scores of regional theatres which are very much part of the local ecosystem, restaurants and bars. People come to the theatre perhaps once a year in these places and go to the pantomime, and it's 3 generations who go together, and they might have a meal before or afterwards. And so, Kate, wearing your UK hat, I mean, is that a concern for you from a regional point of view for theatres and also the hospitality industry on a regional basis?
Absolutely. I think there are particularly acute challenges for London in looking at how you attract international visitors in and visitors back to a city centre where you've got the offices away and working, but it carries all the way through. And increasingly what we're finding is that people will also put a hotel in that. So they make an outing of it for the family. And I think we would see that later this year when people have not been able to have summer holidays, haven't had some of the treats that they would normally have in the first part of the year. I think, if you take Julian's model of the funding, if we were to have some support for the sector as well, not only could we save the pantomime, but we could save the hotel and the theatre trip as a concept, the coach visit, the meal out, the drinks as well. And they are very, very nervous about it in regional town and city centres, because there is no timetable for big events to come back, for mass gatherings. And I think that would be another plea that I would bring in from the hospitality sector. Having that 4th of July date for when we can potentially restart, even though it's conditional and it is a movable feast and we might not know until closer to the time whether we get it, has provided that element of hope and allowed businesses to plan. If you don't have a date, you cannot start to plan and you can't build into your forecasts. So crucially, what we're also concerned about more generally in the regional town and city centres is not just the pantomime, but the whole Christmas events package that goes with it. If you look at the main drag of Park Lane, sorry to bring it back to London again, but as an example, they will have millions of pounds worth of bookings, corporate bookings, event bookings, individual bookings that are in Q4, Halloween to New Year. And we have no idea whether any of those can start, whether any of those can be held. We've got millions of pounds worth of refunds that are potentially falling due. We need government to give an indication to this important bit of the sector where we know it's difficult, but when are these cultural events? What's the aspirational timetable for these big events to be able to reopen? Do the hotels, can they confidently plan for a Christmas pantomime and a Christmas lunch and a Christmas evening event? Can they do that? Can they do, the sort of people coming into central London to go to Christmas markets, to go to carols at the Royal Albert Hall? It's so much of it needs to be planned and happening now. It's all booked. We don't want to have the restart jeopardized because we've got to give a huge amount of refunds. And that goes through, it's a ripple effect. It's the same in High Wycombe. It's the same in Newcastle with the Theatre Royal. It's the same in Durham with the sort of small arts theatre that they've got there. It's felt all the way through suburban and town centres. And the impact will be far greater in those areas where hospitality and tourism and leisure is third most important employer.
Yeah. Roz, so I've just asked
just for 1 second. So
yeah, of course.
Just to reiterate, pantomime is absolutely crucial for regional theatre the length and breadth of this country. More people go to the theatre at Christmas than at any other time of the year. And for most regional theatres, it is pantomime and pantomime alone that gives them the profit to enable them to operate through the rest of the year and to do innovative work and outreach work, which is largely loss-making in some cases. But it's the profit that you make in that 5 or 6 weeks over Christmas and New Year that enables you to do the rest of the year. So not only are theatres faced with terrible problems now being closed, they're faced with missing the core bit of the year that enables them to survive in the long term.
And similarly in hospitality, you've got it almost on a flip side. Summer season is really critical for us. These businesses are going to be facing 3 winters, or in the theatre land, 3 summers. When it's hot and sunny, you don't tend to go into the theatre. They're going to have 3 summers with no income. Lots of hospitality and tourism venues have not had any income. London Eye, for example, no real income since last November. The season is so short for these, either for Christmas when you're doing theatre or for summer season when you have to have enough to be able to generate and sustain for the rest of the year. So back to your point about what can the government do now, if they inject funds and they provide the support needed to sustain these 2 critical economic sectors, it means that they will have it as a shorter period of time. Otherwise, they are going to have to sustain the investment right the way through until the middle of next year at a prolonged level, particularly around furlough. So a small amount of investment now would avoid the government having to have a long-term bailout going forward.
Well, it's just going to you finally. What modelling has the Heart of London Business Association done on possibly the number of businesses that are going to close because of the theatre land not opening up anytime soon and the cultural venues not opening up anytime soon. Have you done any modelling about how many restaurants or bars might close because of the knock-on effect?
We haven't got any specific modelling for the area. It's more anecdotal. We're phoning around our 600 members on a weekly basis almost, and there's no doubt about it. Businesses will be closing if the theatres and the cultural and the arts offer doesn't open soon, because as I say, they are entirely reliant on that trade. Probably more than they ever realized. They're starting to really understand their business now and who their audiences are and where they're coming from. So, because let's face it, this is all about also building customer visitor confidence. And why would you jump on public transport to go to your local, to go to a restaurant that actually you could get on your local high street? It has to be much, much more than that. And in the West End, that is the art and cultural offer. I mean, all of our businesses are important. They all play their part, but you book into a hotel, not in the West End, not just to see the hotel, although apparently the London of this new super boutique, you probably would. But other hotels, really, you're just booking a room to sleep there for the night. You're spending your time out and about visiting all of these cultural destinations and offers. So, for us, in our small patch, but incredibly important patch, we cannot see our area opening successfully without the cultural offer, doing it side by side. With the announcements of the 15th, and even before that, we've had a few of our well-known brands like Fortnum & Mason and Lego open. But on their own, it's really just testing the water, I suppose. On their own, maybe they are strong enough brands to bring in a crowd, but I believe that you need a volume of businesses and an array and a mix of sectors to open to really make it viable. And not to forget that it's this investment in culture, it's not just about tourism, it's also about property investment, because when you speak to property investors, especially individuals or family investment, when you ask them, why did you choose London and why did you choose the West End, actually, they when they're comparing all of their criteria, it's a very close run competition between ourselves and other key cities. It actually comes down to the identity, the culture, the experience, the nitty gritty of the West End in London that actually, it encourages them to sign that check. So, it is a big ecosystem, and possibly we haven't done enough analysis to understand that, but now's the time, I think. I mean, even Nickie, before you moved on from leader of Westminster, one of the final strategies that I think you signed off was the cultural strategy, which really encouraged me. It was the first time I'd seen a council for many years come forward with that. And that really encouraged us to recognise again the importance of our cultural offer. And we're now working with Westminster City Council to look at this interim period of removing the walls and bringing the art and culture back out onto the streets. But it's, as someone said earlier, it won't be about making money. It will be just trying to slowly but surely encourage people back into the area. But right. Absolutely, I've no doubt our businesses will suffer. They are suffering, and they will continue to suffer unless we can get the cultural offer and art offer back up and running.
Well, thanks everybody for your time today. It's been really interesting. If we could just finally, just by summing up all of you, if you could, perhaps starting with Alex, is there one thing, if you had one opportunity now to speak directly to government, to the Secretary of State, Oliver Dowden, or to the Chancellor, or to the Prime Minister, what would your one plea be for the West End, and particularly the cultural and entertainment sectors?
We're absolutely determined to play the fullest part you can possibly imagine in getting through the rest of this crisis and then rebounding from it, bringing people together and celebrating what's so special about this country. But in order to do that, we need your help.
Great. Craig?
Thanks, Nickie. First of all, can I just say this has been the most productive forum I've been involved with since this thing started. Honestly, having an analysis which looks at the whole ecosystem is hugely helpful. So well done to you for pulling it together. I really, really appreciate it. I would say the one thing to government is please consider new protocols for dealing with this safely. The social distancing we have now will not work for the sector. So please, please listen to Julian and the working groups and accept a new protocol.
And Kate?
Can I be difficult and have two? Because I give one to Oliver Dowden, which says, brilliant to have a restart task force that looks at culture, leisure, creative industries. Shockingly poor that you don't have anybody from tourism and hospitality on that top level task force. This is an ecosystem. You cannot do it in isolation. And then to the Prime Minister would be, we're your third largest employer. We generate £40 billion a year in taxes for you each and every year. We know that we can stand up swiftly, safely, and provide a successful restart if you give us the tools to do that. And a large part of that will be to do with flexible furlough and flexibility on the social distancing and the safer working guidelines, because it's about safe working. It's not just about social distancing. If you give us that flexibility, we can be up and running very quickly and get back to doing what we do best.
Thanks. And Roz, anything that you would like to plea for before we finish?
Really, it's investment. It all comes down to money, you know, and to place this cultural and arts industry at the very, very heart of the country's recovery. It's not a side matter. It's at the very, very heart. And what better political legacy could there be than to retain this jewel in our crown?
Thank you. And Julian?
Well, I guess I'd echo what everyone else has said. I'd just add to it in saying, you know, without getting political, in a post-Brexit world, you know, our soft power around the world and using our world-leading cultural organisations to sell what is Britain all about is never going to be more important than over the coming years. In order to do that, we actually have to have our world-leading sector operational. That is at severe risk, and therefore I would say to the Prime Minister, you know, invest a very limited amount of money compared to other sectors in this sector. Bring us back, help us to thrive, and I believe if you do that, we can help regenerate the whole of the West End and indeed towns and cities throughout this country.
Thank you. Julian, without this help, without the government listening and you know, understanding what you guys need and the investment, how many of our venues, particularly in the West End and our iconic venues across the country, how many do you think are at risk of not reopening? Well,
you know, the bold facts are, and we've asked everyone, that 70% of venues will run out of money by the end of the year.
Is that across the country?
Across the country, but that applies to London. We broke it down by London and not London, subsidised, commercial. Now, in order to stop some of those going bust, they will have to make decisions to effectively what you might call mothball, go into hibernation, in order to preserve enough reserves to come out when you know, they can operate without social distancing, unless there is clarity on that in advance. Those decisions, just to be clear, because we haven't actually talked about that, those decisions come to a head at the beginning of July. So we need government to be in active conversation and to give clear direction by the beginning of July, or else basically most major organisations will have to make decisions that will mothball them for a very long period of time. Now, others will have deadlines ahead of that, one or two afterwards, but for the vast majority of people, you know, the beginning of July is the deadline.
So are you saying that without proper government focus and investment, that 70% of our venues are at the threat of closure?
And productions. You've already seen the Phantom of the Opera tour in the UK did 2 venues. They've announced it cannot come back. It's too risky, too expensive with all the uncertainty. You've seen summer seasons, not just Alex's and Craig's, and you've seen, you know, Chichester and the whole Edinburgh festivals, you know, and we're not talking about Edinburgh, but you've seen a whole city's, you know, income for the year sort of wiped out. You know, this is huge stuff.
Okay.
Can I just say as well, Nickie, on hospitality, leaving aside what happens with culture, which is very difficult. We've got 2 weeks before we're making critical decisions, and a third of our venues won't come back, and 1 million jobs will go unless we get the right signals from government in the next 2 to 3 weeks. If you then factor in what might or might not happen with the cultural venues and theatres, etc., that will only accelerate, because we are so dependent upon what they are doing in so many places, that if you have large-scale mothballing of these cultural events and theatres, you will accelerate closures in restaurants, pubs, bars and hotels, because they won't have that business. So we've got 2 weeks, and we've got a third of venues that are already signalling they won't reopen.
Well, that is certainly food for thought, and we have got to focus on this. Thank you so much. I have certainly taken away today the vital economic system, the ecology of the West End, but also across the nation, that cultural venues and theatres play a major part in every local economy, particularly for the hospitality industry. So thank you for that. I promise you I will continue to lobby ministers and secretaries of state for the help for the UK hospitality industry, as well as the theatres and the cultural venues. I want to be able to continue to take my children and enjoy myself to going to the theatre and the restaurants and the bars in the West End. So I'm sure working together, we will be able to save the West End, and particularly save pantomime. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.